Hi BookTube, my name is Juan, I am just one reader, and today I am very excited and very happy to be discussing Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, which is my favorite book of the year so far, and maybe probably one of my favorite books of all time. Wuthering Heights is an incredibly polarizing novel. I think everybody who has read it has a very strong opinion towards it, but it can be very, very negative or extremely positive. It really is one of the most divisive and controversial books that I have come across, especially in classic literature. My whole idea of making this video and my purpose ultimately is to make you read it and to decide for yourself. I want to persuade you into reading it, and I want to give you some pointers as to what I was able to see in the book and why I personally adored it. So my objective in this video is to give you a completely spoiler-free, brief, clear discussion of why I loved Wuthering Heights so much. I want to talk briefly about the synopsis, just spoiler-free, just so you know what it's about. I want to tell you a little bit about the controversy and why people seem to have very different opinions, very polarizing black and white love-hate opinions. I also want to tell you personally why I found it to be absolutely incredible. And I also want to be very, very clear and tell you what to expect and what not to expect, because I feel like that is mainly the reason why people don't agree on this book. It all comes down to how the book has been marketed, what it is, what it appears to be on the outside, but what it truly is on the inside, and the way that you as a reader approach the novel will greatly determine or affect your experience. So let's get started with the controversy, because I really think that is a very crucial aspect to take into consideration when you are thinking about Wuthering Heights, especially as it is perceived here on BookTube and in other reading bookish-oriented communities. Wuthering Heights is one of those books, and especially it's one of those classics that have really earned a reputation. Wuthering Heights has a reputation for stirring up very strong, intense feelings in the reader, and those feelings tend to be ranging from just two opposite sides of a thermometer of hatred or elation and delight. So people absolutely despise the novel because they find the characters are so hateful and so unlikable and annoying and horrible people. Or readers, for some reason, adore the same book with the same characters. So that is a very polarizing point of view or opinion about the same book with the same characters. I have seen people tear each other apart with Wuthering Heights. I have seen people discuss this book and never come to terms with one another. I see people not being able to empathize with other readers who enjoy the book or hate the book when they hate the book or love the book as well. So it's a book that people just can't quite decide what to think of the book as a consensus. It's a very polarizing book, and I think that is a great thing about Wuthering Heights, because whether you fall on one side of the thermometer or the other, you will have very strong feelings towards it, and I think that is a great thing to say about any work of art, especially something that was written so long ago and it still manages to engage people in conversation. Now, personally, before I plucked up the courage to actually pick up the book and read it, I will tell you that I watched many videos and I read many reviews trying to see if there was a consensus, trying to see what people thought, just so I could see if I would enjoy the book, if it was worth reading. It's classic literature, and whenever I pick up a classic book, I want to make sure that it's going to be a rewarding experience, and that all the time and effort that I will dedicate or invest in that book will be rewarded. So I wanted to know, and that's when I realized that this classic Victorian tragic novel was so controversial and so polarizing. I saw videos of people saying that it was the worst book ever, people saying that the characters in the novel were absolutely despicable and completely unredeemable, and that the whole experience was awful. I have seen people discuss it and compare it to a black hole of depression and anguish and anxiety. On the other side, I saw and I have seen people discuss it as one of the best novels of all time, a great tragedy, and just a great portrait of life back in that time period and of these characters. So, what did I think? Stay tuned and you will find out. So, what is Wuthering Heights about? Wuthering Heights is essentially the story of Heathcliff, who is a truly tormented, haunted character. He was adopted into a very strange family when he was a child, when he was very young, and he lives a very particular kind of life. He grows up, and we follow his life as he develops a relationship, and things just keep on taking turns for the worse. And the story takes wonderful turns into tragedy and drama, and it's wonderful. Now, I know that this is a very incredibly vague synopsis of the book, but I really think that in terms of the plot, it's best if you go into Wuthering Heights not knowing that much. I think I knew nothing about the story itself, and I loved finding out how all these things, all these events kept unfolding. So, in terms of plot, that's all I will say, but I will say that it is not a love story. It's not, definitely not a romance. It does involve relationships, but more on that later. There are so many things that I loved about Wuthering Heights, and I want to share a list that I made with you of all the things that I enjoyed and really appreciated in this novel. Hopefully, you will be able to identify with some of these things. If you have not read the book, maybe you can go into this wonderful Victorian novel knowing that these are some positive things. So, firstly, the writing style. Holy grandmother of Christ. This is one of those writing styles that I just, wow. It was very elaborate, very beautiful. It's one of those writing styles that really make you work as a reader, not because they are impenetrable, but just because they are beautifully crafted. And so you really want to take everything slowly and carefully and enjoy it because it's almost poetic. It sounds gorgeous. And I found myself reading many chunks of this novel out loud to myself just so I could hear the way that a character would speak, the way that they would have a kind of melody or rhythm in their speech. And the novel itself has a very particular kind of writing style. I am a very writing style oriented reader. What I mean by that is that what I enjoy the most of reading any book is the writing itself. If a writing is not good enough, I will probably not like a book, even if the story and the characters and the themes are amazing. Here, I loved relishing in the writing style. I would say, I would characterize this writing style as being incredibly elaborate, but sufficiently so that you can really admire it, but never get lost. So it's not difficult to read. I thought the writing was absolutely immersive and atmospheric. Whenever I would sit down and read Wuthering Heights, I would feel transported into another place, another era completely. And I also found it enthralling. I found it incredibly captivating, and it really made me want to keep turning the page. Something else that I really loved about Wuthering Heights is its structure. This novel is perfectly constructed. It has a framing device that actually works really well. It's a little bit like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, where you have a character that you begin the novel with, and then another character comes along and tells the first character a story. And within the story, there is another character telling another story, maybe to another character, and so on and so on. So it's like an onion of layers. You know, you have to peel the layers of the onion to really understand all the different points of view and all the perspectives around the main story or stories. I think the construction and the structure of this book, they really work wonderfully. I really enjoyed it, and I was never lost. I found it very accessible, but it really offered many perspectives, and it just has a great a great entry point into the story, because the main story of Wuthering Heights is the story of Heathcliff and his family, for lack of a better word, and all the people that he has relationships with. But the way that you as a reader look at that story is through the perspective of another character who is the outsider, and his name is Mr. Lockwood, and he's a complete outsider to this whole situation, and he's looking at it and trying to understand what is happening and why is that man doing that and why are they behaving like this. So he is the reader character. He's the character that as a reader you latch onto and try to understand the story through his eyes. So I think that something really wonderful about this framing device is that because it works as a Chinese puzzle box in a way, the story that lies at the center, which is this tragedy, feels almost like a fairy tale or like a cautionary tale, because we have all these characters on the outside layers of the onion talking and commenting on the actual center, the central story of Heathcliff. And so, because of the way that the novel works in terms of its structure, we really get this idea that some of the characters in the story are thinking about the story of Heathcliff. And so, the idea that Heathcliff's story is a little bit like a cautionary tale or a fairy tale of sorts, or a ghost story even, really works well, because it plays with this idea of someone telling a story that has been very tragic and very intense. Another thing that I think was very successful in this novel was the characterization. I think that the characters that Emily Bronte has created in here and the way that she chose to depict them and tell their story is nothing short of remarkable and outstanding. Something that many readers who have hated this novel say as a reason for hating the novel is, oh, the characters. The characters are just awful, horrible people, and they do horrible things to one another, and they are petty, and they are unredeemable, and they are just the worst. Some people actually say it's a very beautifully written book about horrible people. However, I want to politely disagree, and I think that this book is actually a very interesting exercise on empathy, because these characters are so tragic. And what I mean by tragic is that they look awful on the outside. I completely agree. They do horrible things to themselves and to each other and to other generations. It's a book that makes it hard for you, the reader, to really want to look at them in different ways, except, oh, they are awful. So these are characters that Emily Bronte paints on the surface as horrible people, but if you really try to comprehend them and try to understand, again, like an onion of layers, if you try to peel the layers and really get to the essence of the character and understand why they have become the people that they become, and why they do what they do, and why this cycle of revenge and nastiness keeps on happening, you really have to think and you really have to engage with the novel, not just on a shallow level, but you have to really dig deeper. So yeah, I think it's a great exercise on empathy. I think it's a great example of tragic characters whose lives and whose destinies are sealed because of what they have lived and because of the way that they were treated. It's not justifiable. You can't justify what these characters do and who they become just by saying, oh, they had really traumatic childhoods. No, but I think things are much more complex and complicated than some readers make it or make it seem like it is a very shallow novel about horrible characters. I think there's much more complexity in there. So I think overall this book is a perfect tragedy. I think it works perfectly well as a tragedy. It is a tragedy. It is undoubtedly a tragedy. And I think that there's nothing more tragic than following the character of, well, all of the characters really, but mainly the protagonist of the story, who, in my opinion, is Heathcliff. I think that everything that happens to him and everything in the book revolves around him. And I think the book, as a tragedy, really poses very interesting fundamental questions about nurture versus nature and how important education and how important upbringing can be in an individual's life. Again, it's not justifiable. Horrible deeds are not justifiable just because people have had horrible childhoods. Because then we could just, have an excuse for horrible things all the time. However, I think this book does play a very interesting idea out of how much you can forgive a person and how much you can try to understand someone. I think it's a great tragedy because you know from the opening of the book that this is going to be a fatal tale. So it's like a cautionary tale, really. Now, if you know me, you know that I am a practicing psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, and whenever I get a book like this, a book that I can analyze so thoroughly, a book that gives me so much food for thought in terms of psychoanalytical discourse, I get very excited. So I want to take just a few minutes out of this review. I'm going to put the book down. I'm going to take my little whiteboard out, and I want to discuss some psychoanalytical theory that I think is interesting when it comes to discussing Wuthering Heights. I'm sorry if this part of the video is boring, but I think it's provided me with so much to think about. So I think one of the most important psychoanalytical ideas that came to mind when reading and thinking about Wuthering Heights is more contemporary psychoanalysis, not the Freudian classical orthodox psychoanalysis, which is great and still valid and valuable, but I thought more of the modern contemporary psychoanalysis, which stems from the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion. So Bion is, let's say, the modern Freud. He is the most important contemporary psychoanalyst for many years, and a lot of more modern psychoanalysts have stemmed out from his thinking. So Bion has many theories about the mind and about the functioning of the mind. The purpose of this video is not to discuss this, but to discuss a very specific part of this theory, which deals with how thought and experience are processed firstly through the mother's apparatus, and then via identification, the infant learns how to process anxieties, feelings, desires, experiences, and eventually transforms them into thought. So you can read more about Bion and his theory of human development and human thought and experience in many of his books. He has a wonderful book that you can read that I think is pretty accessible, which is Transformations. He has another one called Cogitations, which is harder. He has many books out there, Elements of Psychoanalysis as well. And one of the important things that he proposes in his theory, and that I really thought of when reading Wuthering Heights, is that the mother has an apparatus. This is going to be the mother. And when I say apparatus, I mean her mind, but it goes deeper and farther as a concept than mind. It's more a continuum, an integrated mind body entity, because this also has to do with bodily functions. So the whole apparatus of the mother is going to serve as a sort of matrix of experience for the infant. I'm talking like a newborn infant. So the infant comes to the world with its own apparatus, body and mind, which are one and the same. And the infant is not equipped to really process things. So the infant from very early stages in life is going to be experiencing pain, feelings, sensations in response to the environment, in response to his own bodily functions and needs. It's going to be a mess of experiences. The infant is going to cry, it's going to laugh, it's going to scream, it's going to move around disorganizedly without any objective. So that means that the infant is going to need someone to take care of it, right? Of course, we know that. So the mother comes into play as what Bion calls the container. I really hope you can see my handwriting there. I'm gonna get closer. There it is. So the mother steps in as a container. That means that the infant is going to project into the mother's apparatus, which again, mind and body, one and the same. The infant is going to project all of the things that he can't quite process yet by himself into the mother, who is going to function if she or he is sufficiently healthy enough. And when I say mother, it's not the actual physical mother. It can be the mother, it can be a father figure, it can be any caregiver, anyone who takes care of a child. And it's actually a function that is carried by many people in a child's development. So it's not just one individual who does this, but you get my drift. This is a theoretical symbol for what he's trying to explain. So the infant is going to project all of the things that it can't quite process yet by itself. These are going to be called beta elements. And the beta elements are things that the child, the infant, can't yet think, can't transform into thought. It's just messy, disorganized experience that is usually very unpleasant and filled with frustration. So, for example, pain, right? Or hunger, or anger, or any kind of physical, emotional, mental discomfort. So, beta elements are, let's say, uncomfortable and they create discomfort. So that's why the child has to project them violently into the mother, the container, and the mother has to carry out a process of something along the lines of an emotional digestion, and this is called reverie. Reverie, which means dreaming in French. The mother has to dream with the infant, according to Bion. The mother has to try to decode what the infant needs. That's the same thing that I'm explaining here. The mother needs to dream or process what the infant is projecting onto her, so that then the mother can try to do something about it. That do something about it, it's called alpha function. The alpha function is when the mother tries to understand what the baby needs and tries to help him or her. And so the mother will give the infant something back. So the mother, because she has processed what the infant could not process himself, the mother is returning the same anxieties or discomforting experiences, uncomfortable, painful experiences, but they are coming back in a contained way. So, through this process of reverie and alpha functioning, the mother transforms what was uncontainable into something that can be contained and safely containable by the infant. So, a very easy everyday life example of this is when you see a kid or an infant cry, and the mother tries to understand why they are crying and what they can do to help the infant or the boy. And in doing so, the kid immediately tranquilizes and calms down, and there's a sense of being listened to and being taken care by someone, and that's exactly this alpha function. So this is a process that goes on and on and on all the time whenever the infant experiences something that is uncomfortable and that has to be projected and that has to be safely returned as something contained. When this process happens organically and without great difficulty, the infant will develop his own alpha function. Alpha, right there. So what is the alpha function? The alpha function is the process, the ability of turning emotional turmoil into thought and being able to put into images and thoughts and words and symbols what once could not be experienced except through the mother. So I hope that is clear enough. Again, this is psychoanalytical contemporary theory. I think it's fairly simple to understand, but I don't know if it's easy to explain. So I hope I did my best. Now, what does this have to do with Wuthering Heights? Well, this process that Bion describes of projecting and then the mother safely returning that which was projected but in a safe way, that is what we call in psychoanalysis projective identification. And that is a process that we can see happen in Wuthering Heights all the time, except it happens in a very unsuccessful way. So in Wuthering Heights, something that keeps on happening and happening and happening all the time is characters attack one another, not because they want to destroy one another, but rather because they don't know how else to convey an emotional, decoded message, which is a symbol of something else. And so the only way that they have available in their apparatus, mind, body, is through aggression. And that's why Wuthering Heights reads and feels like a non-stop attacking of one another, and it never ends. It never ends. It's just destruction, destruction, destruction. Because something that happens according to Bion and this whole theory of modern Bionian psychoanalysis is that when this process of healthy projective identification is not properly worked through, the mother will respond to the infant in an unhealthy manner. Therefore, the infant will grow up with certain emotional and thinking deficits. So when that infant grows and then has another offspring, the infant the person who used to be the infant and is now the father or mother of the new baby, they will be ill-equipped to really carry out the reverie and alpha functions with the new generation. So it becomes a truncated, damaged, broken process of projective identification. It doesn't become a healthy projective identification, it becomes a pathological projective identification. And therefore, we see how from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, emotional deficit is inherited. This has a lot to do with some theories in psychology and psychoanalysis specifically that talk about the idea of generational trauma or generational deficits of some kind. Some people might think that it has to do with a genetic deficit, and sometimes it is, but most of the times, because we don't have many evidence to support that it is purely genetic. We actually don't have a lot of evidence to support that. But what we do have evidence of is how this processes of helping the new generation process things is not carried out properly. And that's how we explain generational trauma or inherited issues. Many times, as a psychoanalyst, I have seen a patient, an individual who comes to me looking for help because they are suffering from something that is partly theirs, but partly it belongs to someone else, to the previous generation, because of unresolved issues from that generation. And that those issues of that generation are probably connected to issues that were never resolved from the previous generation. So it becomes a chain of events, and that is very interesting. So as a psychoanalyst, I really loved the way that pathological projective identification was depicted and conveyed in this story. I think that it's a great story about parents and children and how that relationship, which is in many ways our most important and essentially inherently conflicting relationship in our lives, how it plays out and how it becomes very pathological, and it really does horrible things to these characters. I think that this idea of generational abuse, generational trauma, is clear evidence of pathological projective identification and narcissism as well, which go hand in hand. So I think this is also a story that you can interpret as a story about education in general and how important thinking about education is. It's very relevant to think of how we treat our children and how we deal with the new generations. Again, you can read Wuthering Heights as a cautionary tale of what not to do and what not to pass on to your children. And yeah, it's a story that is very sad, more than annoying or frustrating as some readers make it out to be. I think it's a very sad story because you know that these characters will never be able to escape their destiny and their identities, because they have so much conflict, so deeply rooted in the essence of them that they really don't have any other options except kill each other and die. And I mean that internally, they really suffer horrible consequences. I'm very, very sorry if it just took me forever to discuss psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical ideas. I hope I didn't make this really boring. But before I go, I just want to say what to expect and what not to expect from Wuthering Heights, because I think that in this book in particular, it is incredibly important to approach it the right way. Many people have marketed this story or sold this story as a love story or some kind of tragic romance. Actually, there's an episode of Friends where Phoebe and Rachel and then Monica go to a book class where it's like a reading workshop, and they are discussing Wuthering Heights, and someone says it's a tragic love story, and I'm like, no, it's not a tragic love story, it's just a tragedy. But there's no love because, again, as psychoanalysis tells us, when there is pathological projective identification we are not dealing with love. We are dealing with aggression and idealization. And well, I don't want to get into psychoanalysis yet again. Oh my god, this video is going to be like 3 hours long and you will hate me forever. So this is not a love story. If you approach this book as a love story, you will die of boredom, you will die of sadness, depression, you will die of a heart attack and from an anxiety crisis, because it's not what it is. So what should you expect from Wuthering Heights? I think you should expect a complicated story, and by complicated, I don't mean a story that is hard to follow, because it isn't, but I mean a story that is going to be much more complex, a story that you really have to think about and ponder carefully, because otherwise you will just get annoying characters doing petty things to one another. No, you really have to work for it. This is, in my opinion, a much better novel than Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Even though I love Jane Eyre, because it is great, it does many wonderful things, I think Jane Eyre is a plainer story. I think it's a much less complicated story. It's not to say that it's not complicated, but I think Wuthering Heights, to me, in my opinion, is a much more sophisticated novel. It's much more successful, and it's far more interesting and fascinating. So I have said before that this book is like an ugly child that you really have to adopt and learn how to love. Whereas Jane Eyre is more like, that golden boy that everybody likes, and it's just very easy to fall in love with, or to take into your family. But no, I think Wuthering Heights is much more fascinating. And that's really all I can say here. Now that I'm thinking about Jane Eyre and this sort of analogy, I would say that I think that you really have to approach this book in particular with very modest, adjustable expectations. It's a little bit like the novel The Little Friend by Donna Tartt. It's a book that I think is absolutely stunning, but many people hate because of their expectations of what that novel is going to be. And even though it is a wonderful novel with a lot of complexity, because it doesn't satisfy what the reader thinks it will, it's very frustrating. And I think this could potentially have the same issue. I think if you go into this book looking at it as a tragedy, a fairy tale-esque story, a cautionary tale about abuse and generational trauma and the tragedy, the true character of a person's life embodied in Heathcliff, you will really love it. That is my non-spoiler review and recommendation of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I gave this book 5 stars. If I could give it 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stars, I would. I think this is a perfect novel in many ways. It's a complex novel, beautifully written, and it's a novel that I know will keep on giving. This is a book that I will reread eventually many times over, because I can just see how much more I can get from this book upon many future rereads. So this is my favorite book of the year so far, probably my favorite classic ever, alongside The Picture of Dorian Gray. I just love that book. But yeah, I hope you enjoy, and I look forward to all of your comments down below. I am sure this comment section is going to be very polarizing and very interesting.